Welcome to Riks, Dr. Gutierrez. Could you please tell me, what is the situation in Cuba right now?
The situation in Cuba is that you have a totalitarian state, one-party state that is run by one powerful family, the Castro family, and a small group of generals who have enriched themselves from the Cuban people. It is a state where elections have not been held, free multi-party elections have not been held for 66 years, where the most incredible economic restrictions are placed on the population, on the countryside, on the workers, Cubans. It's very difficult for Cubans to have their own business, to be able to be independent economically. Farmers are severely restricted. Just to give you one example, by 1959, which was when the Communist Revolution took place, Cuba was an agricultural powerhouse. It fed itself, which is very difficult for a developing country, and it aggressively exported food and competed in the U.S. market. Today, Cuba depends on imports of food from the U.S., from Europe, and for Canada to survive. So the Cuban countryside was destroyed by communism. It's a country where the priority for the government has been ideological expansion into the hemisphere and the world, and the Cuban people come second or third. So therefore, the energy industry is a disaster. Again, by 1959, Cuba was at the forefront of Latin America in the generation of electricity and even in the exportation of electricity. Today, Cubans are suffering from blackouts that last up to 40 hours. And that is due to the terrible system, the energy system that fell apart, and the corruption of the regime. So my people are suffering from a terrible dictatorship that is supposedly communist, but which actually enriches a few ruling families.
If you look at the current situation in Cuba, and of course one of the major players here is the United States foreign policy when it comes to this. You have a new president in the United States right now, Donald Trump. His vice president, J.D. Vance, caused quite a ruckus in Europe when they announced a new policy on how they view Europe. How will the Trump administration handle Cuba?
The Trump administration, in the first Trump administration, he had very good policies on Cuba. You must understand we're dealing with a corrupt totalitarian regime that doesn't want to make changes. So pressure has to be applied. And President Trump implemented a series of sanctions that were very intelligent, aimed at the military and repressive sector of the regime, which is most of the regime. The military control the economy. And these measures have been very instrumental and useful in making space for the Cuban people to express themselves and to advocate for freedom. Over 1,000 Cubans are political prisoners because of their defense of democracy. That includes women, it includes a lot of women political prisoners, young artists, young intellectuals, religious people who are simply in prison for speaking out because they want to change in their lives. So the Trump policies have been effective, and so far the steps that the Trump administration has taken on Cuba in these first few days have been generally in the right direction. We believe that the more pressure you put on that regime, the more space there is for the Cuban people.
Well, you're obviously here in Sweden right now and in Europe. What's the purpose of you being here?
Sweden has an excellent foreign policy on Cuba. Sweden has put human rights #1 in Cuba. And Sweden is leading the effort for the Europeans to stop financing this regime in Havana. This is a dictatorship. And there's something called the Political Dialogue and Cooperation Agreement, PDCA, with the regime, that sends the regime about 155 million euros per year. That agreement was entered into supposedly to take Cuba away from the Russian orbit and to improve human rights situation 7 years ago. Lithuania never ratified the agreement because they knew it would fail. 7 years later, Sweden has stood up and said, it's been 7 years, the human rights situation is worse, and there are 5,000 Cuban communist troops fighting under Russian orders against Ukraine. So that money being sent to the regime in Cuba should be sent to Ukraine to help defend themselves against the Russian invasion. Why is Europe throwing away this money with a vicious regime that is anti-European? The puppet president of Cuba last year, he told Putin that he wished him success in the special military operation. Why should Europe be paying for this?
But you mentioned that there are Cuban soldiers in Ukraine right now. Could you elaborate a bit on that? What's going on?
There are 5,000 Cuban mercenary troops in Ukraine. I have interviewed one of them who was captured by the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians estimate that of these 5,000, about 60% are young men who have been manipulated and fooled and sent to fill in holes in the trenches, but about 40% are Cuban special forces, trained killers. And they have participated in key battles like the Battle of Bakhmut. Some Cubans were decorated for what they did in Bakhmut in support of the Russians. So it's an important participation by these Cuban troops. And not just that, the regime in Cuba, internationally, they've lent their diplomacy and their information efforts to supporting this aggression against Ukraine. Why should Europeans be paying for that? Why should public money from Europe be paying for this regime? And it's not just the PDCA, the agreement with the European Union. There's something called the Club of Paris that handles public funds from Europe, and most people don't know what the Club of Paris is. The Club of Paris has given this regime billions in the last few years, and all that comes from European taxpayers. Why should this continue? How is it serving European interests to finance a regime that is anti-European?
Would you say that the European elites are naive when it comes with dealing with the communist dictatorship, that if we send them money, they will become suddenly a liberal democracy? Would you say that we have been naive here in Europe, that we keep on giving this type of...
I think that's an excellent question. That's a very good question. I think there may be some who are naive, but that's not the core of it. The European deep state, deep down, has a very left-wing ideology. And they see the regime in Cuba as a regime that is doing everything they have always promoted, every policy they want, at the expense of the Cuban people. So for that deep state, it's important for this regime to stay in power as a reference, as a symbol of the left-wing revolution. But in reality, it's a deadly regime that oppresses the Cuban people and has driven them into poverty.
But if we look, for in Sweden example, there is a classical picture of the previous social democratic prime minister of Sweden, Olof Palme. He was shooting guns together with Fidel Castro. Have you said that the Europeans at least have gotten a bit more sensible in that sense, or are they still keeping on this naivety and thinking, oh, it's an anti-colonial statement to support this government?
I think leaders like Olof Palme knew very little about Cuban history, the real history of Cuba, knew very little about Cuban culture. And their interest in Cuba was because it was a convenient left-wing revolution that they could point to as an example of successful socialism. It wasn't that. And that's not the history of my people or of Cuba. I think that to a great degree, Cuba has been an ideological tool of left-wing forces and elitist forces in Europe, and not a true representation of what happens to a people subjugated by communism. We have found a lot more understanding for countries who have gone through communism in Europe than among those who haven't had that terrible experience. But the movement against the regime in Cuba and Europe is growing. You have outstanding members of parliament like Bjorn Soder who have taken the leadership in that issue. He has done a lot of good for Cuba. That is why he's so popular among Cubans, and we're very thankful. Marcos Vichel has also been very good in helping us at the Council of Europe and European Parliament. Last year, the European Parliament approved 2 resolutions calling for the end of this financing. So there is change, and it's in the right direction. We just needed to increase faster, because Europe should not be paying for Cuban troops in Russia or for repression at home.
And finally, or to summarize, since you're the outspoken leader of the Cuban resistance against the communist regime there, do you see any foreseeable changes in the future here? Because Fidel Castro's brother is still in power. As you said, you have a puppet president that still obeys the Castro regime, more or less. Do you see any? Do you see a light in the tunnel in that sense? Is there anything that points in the direction that you will have a meaningful change into Cuba, and you might go away from a socialist or communist totalitarian dictatorship to actually start to reform the country? Do you think we'll see that in the near future?
I think that it's the closest we've been in the history of our resistance to change in Cuba, because of the defiance of the Cuban people because of the increasing protests in Cuba. There's been resistance for 66 years, but now it's more open than ever because the Trump sanctions weakened the regime. So we're very close. We just need the real support of the democratic forces in the world to bring this regime to an end and open to a democratic transition. It's the closest we've been. That's why we need help at this point. And the Cuban people have shown that they want to be free, repeatedly. You have to understand our country is being driven into destruction. There's been a massive exodus of Cubans. The Cuban birth rate is terrible. Cubans are the one Latin American country not reproducing at a rate of survival. The hunger, the poverty in Cuba is terrible, and it's all man-made. It's all the result of communist ideology. Cuba needs change. Cubans have been successful every time they've been free, and they've been successful every country they've gone to. I'm very proud of the Cubans in Sweden, how well they've done here. Cubans are only poor, and they're only desperate in Cuba because of communism.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gutiérrez.
Thank you.